There is a bird watching you right now. You don't know it, you've never thought about it. But somewhere, on a wire above your street, or in the oak tree at the edge of your yard, or on the ledge of the building you walk past every single morning, there is a crow, and it has been watching you far longer than you realize. It watched you the day you wore the red jacket. It watched you the morning you were running late and didn't look up. It watched you when you threw that piece of bread crust onto the pavement, and the day you didn't. And unlike the pigeons, unlike the sparrows, unlike every other creature that populates the background noise of your daily life, this bird remembers, not for a day, not for a week, for years. The question that scientists, philosophers, and the curious alike have struggled to fully answer is not simply, can crows remember human faces? Research has proven beyond any reasonable doubt that they can. The question, the one that keeps researchers awake at night, the one that changes everything we thought we understood about the boundary between human and animal consciousness, is why. Why would a wild bird, a creature with a brain the size of a walnut, dedicate precious neural architecture to the lifelong memory of a single human face? What does a crow want from you? What is it waiting for? Stay with me, because the answer is not what you expect. And once you understand it, truly understand it, you will never look at a crow the same way again. In 2008, a behavioral ecologist at the University of Washington, named John Marsloff, conducted an experiment that, at first glance, seemed almost absurdly simple. He and a team of volunteers put on rubber Halloween masks, crude, featureless caveman faces, and captured wild crows on the campus grounds, banding their legs before releasing them. The capturing itself was brief, clinical, ordinary. The aftermath was anything but. For weeks after the capture, every time anyone wore those specific masks and walked through the campus, the crows, not just the ones who had been captured, but crows throughout the entire area, would dive bomb them. They would scold them from the treetops with alarm calls so piercing that other birds fled. They would follow them across the length of the campus, warning others, coordinating, organizing their fury with what could only be described as deliberate, strategic intent. When volunteers wore different masks, neutral faces, unfamiliar faces, the crows ignored them entirely. This was a crow who had been held, briefly, in a bag, and it never forgot the face responsible. But Marsloff's experiment did not end there, because that, on its own, could be explained as simple conditioned fear response. What happened next went considerably further. Over the following years, the crow's memory did not fade. If anything, it deepened. The scolding grew more organized, and stranger still, young crows who had never been captured, who had been born after the initial experiment, were scolding the masked faces just as aggressively as the original birds. They had never been harmed. They had never been touched. But they had learned, from their parents, from the flock. The memory of a specific human face had been socially transmitted across generations of wild birds. Think about what that means for a moment. A crow who has never met you can already know whether to trust you, because its mother told it to watch for someone who looks like you. We like to think of the natural world as a place of instinct and reaction, of stimulus and response, of creatures living purely in the present tense. We comfort ourselves with the idea that the birds we walk past each morning are simply unaware of us. Background noise, just as we treat them as background noise. But crows have been quietly dismantling that assumption for millions of years. The brain of a crow, though small soul in absolute size, is extraordinarily dense with neurons relative to its volume. Comparable, neuroscientists have noted with some discomfort, to the cortical ratios found in primates. The region of the crow's brain responsible for higher-order thinking, what researchers call the nidopallium caudolateral, functions in a manner strikingly parallel to the prefrontal cortex in humans, the seat of planning, decision-making, and social reasoning. In other words, the part of a crow's brain that watches you, thinks about you, not reflexively, not automatically, deliberately, and at the University of Cambridge, researchers found that crows and other corvids possess what scientists term episodic-like memory, the ability to recall not just what happened, but where it happened, and critically, when. They can reconstruct the past. They can project into the future. They can hold a face in their minds, your face, and attach to it a narrative, a history, a verdict. You are not just a shape to a crow, you are a story. And the story it has written about you has been running longer than you know. There is a woman in Seattle named Gabby Mann. She was 8 years old when the crows began leaving her gifts. It started simply enough. She dropped food, they ate it. She began doing it deliberately. Every morning, she would set out water and peanuts on a tray in the backyard before school. The crows came. They always came. And then one morning, beside the empty peanut tray, she found something she had not left. A small, blue-tinted button. Smooth, deliberately placed. Then a piece of foil, folded carefully into a tiny square. Then a corroded screw, positioned neatly at the tray's center as if offered. Then a rusted metal clip. Then a small, heart-shaped earring, found later to have been lost by Gabby's mother 2 weeks prior, somewhere in the yard. The crows had found it, and they had brought it back. Gabby Mann now has a collection of over 200 objects given to her by crows over the years, cataloged in labeled bags with dates and descriptions. Scientists who have examined the collection note that the objects are consistently small, shiny, or textured in ways that suggest intentional selection. These are not random scraps. These are chosen. This is a phenomenon researchers call reciprocal gifting, and it is one of the most profoundly unsettling discoveries in modern behavioral ecology, not because it is dangerous, but because it forces an uncomfortable question. If a crow can feel something that compels it to bring you a gift in exchange for your kindness, what does that feeling resemble? And if a crow can feel gratitude, then the inverse, the dark mirror of that same capacity, must also be true. In the Pacific Northwest, wildlife researchers have documented cases of crows holding what can only be described as organized campaigns against specific individuals who harmed them. One documented case involved a construction worker who, during a building project, routinely shooed crows away from their nesting site with aggressive gestures and occasional thrown objects. What followed lasted 3 years. Crows would wait near his route to work. They would dive from directly above, striking the top of his head. They deposited feces on his car, specifically his car, in a parking lot shared with dozens of others. They recruited additional crows. They taught their fledglings. The man eventually changed his route to work. The crows did not forget. And here is what makes this not merely interesting, but genuinely, philosophically staggering. The crow that eventually dove at him on his new route had never been present for the original confrontation. It had been told, there is a word for a creature that can hold a grudge across time, transmit it socially, and organize coordinated retribution. We call that creature many things. We rarely call it a bird, but there is a second dimension to crow memory that science has barely begun to map, and it is, in some ways, even more remarkable than their capacity for grievance. Crows remember kindness with the same fidelity that they remember harm. Researchers at the University of Exeter found that crows in urban environments consistently adjusted their behavior toward individual humans based on repeated positive interactions, returning to the same locations, calling in tones that other researchers described as distinctly different from alarm or territorial calls, softer, lower, almost conversational. There is a man in Tokyo who has fed the same family of jungle crows for 11 years from his apartment balcony. He has watched 3 generations grow, and he told researchers that when he is ill and misses a morning, they wait on the railing longer than usual, that when he returned from a 6-week hospital stay, they were there within minutes of his stepping onto the balcony. Before he had opened the food container, before he had made any sound, they recognized him. After 6 weeks. Through his changed gait, his slower movements, perhaps the altered scent of illness, they knew him, and they had waited. To understand why crows remember faces with such precision, And for so long, you need to understand something fundamental about how their minds are structured. And to do that, you need to release a comfortable assumption most of us carry quietly without even knowing it. We assume that intelligence is proportional to size, that a bigger brain means a more capable mind, that somewhere in the vast gulf between a human skull and a bird skull, consciousness must thin out to something barely worthy of the word. That assumption is wrong. The crow's brain does not look like ours, but it solves the same problems. In some cases, faster. When Cambridge neuroscientist Nicola Clayton began studying corvid cognition in the late 1990s, she made a discovery that genuinely shook the field of comparative psychology. Western scrub jays, close relatives of crows, were not simply caching food for later retrieval. They were doing something far more architecturally complex. When a jay cached food while being observed by another jay, it would return to that cache when alone and move it to a new location, but only if the observing bird had itself previously stolen food from others. Ride that again, slowly. The jay was modeling the intentions of another individual. It was reasoning, this bird has stolen before, therefore this bird may steal from me, therefore I should protect myself by moving the cache. But, crucially, it only did this when it itself had stolen food previously. Birds with no history of stealing did not show this behavior. The jay was projecting its own past behavior onto another's potential future behavior. This is called theory of mind, the ability to model what another thinking being knows, believes, or intends. For decades, this was considered a uniquely human cognitive capacity, then uniquely primate, then uniquely mammalian. The scrub jay, and by close neurological extension, the crow, shattered that boundary entirely. And if a crow possesses theory of mind, then when it looks at you, it is not simply registering your face as a neutral visual pattern. It is asking a question. It is building a model of who you are, what you have done, what you might do. Whether you are a threat, a resource, a curiosity, or an ally, it is, in the most precise scientific sense of the phrase, thinking about you. Now consider this. A crow typically lives between 7 and 14 years in the wild. Some, in sheltered urban environments, have been documented living past 20, and their facial recognition, once encoded, appears remarkably resistant to the typical erosion of memory. Studies have shown that crows presented with images of human faces they haven't encountered for multiple years can still sort them accurately into threat and non-threat categories, with response latencies suggesting that the recognition is not labored retrieval, but something closer to immediate, reflexive knowing, like the way you recognize your mother's face. Without thinking, without trying. The crow's face recognition system is housed in a neural pathway researchers have only recently begun mapping, a pathway that connects visual processing centers to social memory regions in an architecture that, structurally, parallels the way human faces are processed in the fusiform face area of the human brain. The parallel is not perfect, but it is close enough to be, depending on your philosophical disposition, either deeply comforting or deeply unsettling. The crow sees you the way you see the people who matter most to you, with that kind of sight, that kind of retention. And here is the detail that tends to silence a room when researchers present it at conferences. Crows do not just remember faces from the front. They have demonstrated recognition of partially obscured faces, faces wearing hats, faces seen only in profile. They adjust for transformation. They compensate for change. One researcher who had worked with the same crow population for years underwent chemotherapy and lost her hair. The crows, who had never shown alarm behavior toward her in years of interaction, began responding with mild alarm calls for several weeks. Then, gradually, they recalibrated, updated their model of her. The alarm calls stopped. They had noticed she was different. They had waited. They had decided she was still her.